spreadsheet, this basically shows you how many blocks you had put on your diagram. Okay, so you have the mass of each block, which since I didn't duplicate any, I just had a mass of 1. But then we have the x and y coordinates of each of the blocks. So what we're going to do is we're going to test and make sure that the centroid that you got on the Gizmo, which let's go back to that Gizmo really fast. The centroid that I got, which in this case is negative 0.06, comma 1.12, that if I were to do the centroid formula with these points, would I get the exact same value? Okay? So you're going to create a spreadsheet and you're going to add on to this basically. So we have the areas of each one obviously is very straightforward. The area of each block is how much? Okay, it's 1, right? So that when we think about it as x times a, right? We think of x times a, there's really no area to multiply it by because we've made the areas all 1. So all we really need to do is think of it as x coordinate, because this is the centroid value, right? And then the y coordinates. And if I add all of these x values up, like so, using the sum function, b2 to b18 in my case, right? Oops, I forgot the b, 18. If I add all of those up, I get negative 1. Okay? And if I then also do the same thing for y, if I can just copy and paste this formula into here, I get 19. Okay? Now, how many points did I have on that grid? Okay? I had from 2 to 18. So one thing I could do is I could actually just do this, equals count of A2. I could also just count myself, of course, but I can also just use the count function and get a value there. Okay? So that means I'm going to take this sum and I'm going to divide by the total area. And since each block is 1 unit in area, the total area would be used in this function as 17. And remember, our formula for the centroid coordinates is the sum, and I'm going to text this here basically, sum of all of the x times a's divided by the sum of the a, the total area, right? And then, of course, for the y coordinate, it's the same formula, equals sum of y times a divided by the sum of a. But again, since all the areas individually are 1, we're really just having to add the x and the y coordinates. And remember, the x and the y coordinates of this are the centroid locations. Where the squares are placed on the grid is where the centroid is, okay, for that individual square. So to get the x and y coordinates of the centroid, I'm just going to take this number right here. These represent my x times a's and my y times, oops, and my y times a, right? It doesn't like that because I want it just text, okay? Those two values equal those two things. All I have to do is just take this value and divide by that value. If I take this x times a value and divide by the sum of the areas, that should be the x coordinate of my centroid. So if I do b20 divided by a21, I get that value, negative 0.05882. If I do it for the y value, I get the same for the y coordinate, which is just basically c20 divided by a21. And I get that. Now remember, my x and y coordinates of my centroid, according to the Gizmo, were negative 0.06 and 1.12. So the values I get here, I know it's small, but the values I get here, let's zoom in, okay, make it 200%. The values I get here of negative 0.05882 for x and 1.117 for y, are those the centroid values that I got on the Gizmo? Yes, they are. Okay, so your job in this assignment basically is to do exactly this. It's to create your initials. You're going to create your initials in the Gizmo, first, last initial, and you're going to get a centroid value. You're going to then export the data. There's a button down here called Export Data, bottom right corner, that exports your information into an Excel spreadsheet. You're going to load up that Excel spreadsheet, which is going to basically give you the mass of each square, the x and the y coordinates of the centroid. And then you're going to determine if the coordinates that the Gizmo came up with for your centroid are indeed the correct values. Okay? Now, if you want to, you can feel free to make some of your blocks have a greater mass. But keep in mind, if you do that, you're going to have to calculate the x times a differently. So obviously it's easiest if you keep it as 1, but if you'd like to challenge yourself a little bit and make some of these blocks more than 1, then all you have to, like, say, for example, let's say this block right here was 3, right? Well, now this is the x and y value for the centroid, but because there's more mass here, this has more to do with the centroid value. So you'd actually have to do your B4 times A4 here, right? And I forgot the equal sign. And then you'd also have to do the C4 times A4 here, right? So you'd actually have to do separate calculations, x times A, y times A. Okay, so if you decide to make the masses different other than 1, you would just have to make a separate column, and then you'd have to do your math from that column. So obviously, if I copy and paste this to other cells, you'll notice that it's still the same thing, right? Okay? So if you'd like to challenge yourself, I think that I recommend you give that a shot. Okay? So your x times A, your y times A, and then of course you would have to do the same calculations down here, sum and divide by the count, by how many blocks you used. Okay? All right. So that's the assignment for this morning.